Okay, so starting on with nitric oxide. So let's go into it. What is nitric oxide? Well, probably a good question to ask at this point. The introduction. Okay, so nitric oxide is a gaseous signaling molecule that easily diffuses across cell membranes and can produce multiple physiological and pathophysiological events. So from this definition, we really understand that nitric oxide really takes part in normal body functions, which are physiological, and also has some part in the pathophysiology of many different diseases. And this is really not what's going on the media and internet. And as you can see the picture here, it's showing you a supplement of nitric oxide. Well, L-arginine is an amino acid which is then turned into nitric oxide by our bodies. We'll talk about that in the synthesis. But the thing is that there is such a big halo around this molecule in media, being that it's a very good molecule, but we really kind of forget about the pathophysiological components of it. So nitric oxide synthesis enzymes. So if you want to produce something, of course, you gotta have an enzyme to produce it more efficiently and more quickly. And I don't really want to go into details, but all I want you to know is that there are three types of enzymes. You've got something called the neuronal nitric oxide synthase, and the inducible nitric oxide synthase, and the endothelial nitric oxide synthase. So these were classified according to their signaling. So they're gonna produce nitric oxide, and that nitric oxide is gonna produce a certain function, and of course also according to the region where these enzymes are functioning. So you can see how the neuronal is more found in neurons, skeletal muscle, and also how the inducible one, which is mainly we call it inducible because it's got a relationship to inflammation, so it's increased a lot in cases of inflammation. And of course the endothelial, which is what happens in the endothelium of your cardiovascular system. So you can see it's available in endothelial cells and also sometimes found in neurons. So nitric oxide synthesis. Well, the way that our body produces nitric oxide, there are two ways in which you can produce it. The first way that we're going to talk about is the alternative pathway. So it's right here, we're looking at this picture. This is called an alternative pathway, in which you produce nitric oxide from the food that you take. So you can see here, there's this food right here, it contains nitrate. You eat this food, and of course, you have your microbiome. Everybody's heard of the microbiome. So basically bacteria, and these bacteria is found on the tongue. And so when you have this bacteria on your tongue, it's able to change this nitrate into nitrite, which then is gone into the stomach. The stomach is low pH. The nitrite is turned into nitric oxide. Now, it's important to note that not all of this nitrate and nitrite is turned into nitric oxide. There is some left, and the good thing about this way of synthesis is that the remaining can actually go through absorb through the intestines into the bloodstream and back into the into the salivary glands, and secreted into the oral cavity back again for these bacteria to get another chance to produce nitrites, and then which are then made into nitric oxide in the stomach again. So this is called the enterosalivary circulation. Okay, now here we have another different process, in which this is the process that our body produces nitric oxide without the help of bacteria. It produces it on its own, and the picture gets kind of intimidating. So you can see that there's an endothelial cell, so we're probably we're in a vessel, and we've got smooth muscle. So you can see that the arginine right here, which is an amino acid we talked about, is being transformed into nitric oxide by the endothelial nitric oxide synthase. And this enzyme was basically stimulated by calcium. So you already know that smooth muscle contracts to calcium. We'll talk about the role of nitric oxide in vasodilation, in protecting from excess calcium and excess contraction later on. So the signaling pathways. So the nitric oxide that is being produced is going to signal for multiple, as we said, physiological functions in our body. And it can either increase cyclic GMP, which is responsible for inhibiting the amounts of calcium, increased amount of calcium, leading to vasodilation. It can also cause platelet inactivation, preventing thrombosis. This nitric oxide, funny enough, can actually be stored by a process called S-nitrosylation. So it's stored by nitrosylating a molecule we've all heard of. It's called glutathione. So people who have vascular diseases, have diabetes, are low on this storage molecule because we already know that nitric oxide is very important in producing vasodilation, as we can see right here. So these people will have low amounts of glutathione, and therefore, of course, they're going to have diseases. So another way which this nitric oxide can, because in certain diseases like degenerative diseases, inflammatory diseases, you get a lot of a molecule called superoxide, which is kind of like a radical. It binds with the nitric oxide, produces reactive oxygen species, and this can signal for actually tissue damage. So we can see here how much there's being tissue damage, and this is kind of a downside. That's part of, this is like the pathophysiological component of nitric oxide. And of course, you can also use in the laboratory the product being produced by nitric oxide binding with the superoxide. It's called peroxynitrite. You can actually measure. I put a ruler here just to note that you can measure the amounts, and in certain diseases you can know what is basically causing this tissue damage and inflammation by measuring the levels of peroxynitrite. So therapeutic uses of COVID-19. I was really stunned by reading about a certain article was talking about how COVID-19 and nitric oxide, or how nitric oxide may be protective against COVID-19. So the story started like this, that they realized in China that smokers were not being infected by COVID-19, which sounds very intimidating to say, but the population of smokers in China was 52% and only 10% were being infected. Same numbers, there was seen lower numbers of people infected in USA, France, and Italy, which was something to for the scientists to ask themselves, why are these people being protected against COVID? Isn't smoking something bad? Well, it is bad, but what was happening is that the cigarettes, the way that you smoke a cigarette is by taking a puff. So that's a puff, okay? So, and then you push out the air. So this puff, each puff contains large amounts of nitric oxide, which was what the scientists thought was participating in this protective mechanism against COVID-19. So, and then after this, they did in vitro, so in the lab experiments. They even saw that nitric oxide can inhibit viral replication. So it might be something that they should be looking up to more. So basically, nitric oxide is helping in preventing in contracting the disease, but it's also important to know that I don't want to say that smoking is protective against COVID-19, because smoking in other articles has been seen to actually make the disease worse in people who are already infected. So smoking is not, it only protects against the contraction of the disease because it has this nitric oxide molecule. So as we said, they were doing in vitro, so things were being done in the lab, and they were testing virus cells against nitric oxide and tissue grafts. But what about in real humans? Don't we have to test about real humans what's going on? And so they tested using this machine. It works basically the same mechanism as this smoking, and it's called a inopulse. So you take in puffs of nitric oxide at very high concentrations. Now, this machine has already treated 180 patients from COVID-19, and this has led to this machine being used and studied further in phase 3 trials, which still the results hasn't been published, but it could be something very inspiring to actually treat the COVID-19. So to sum it up, this is the last slide. I know I've taken some of your time, but as we know, we talked about nitric oxide being synthesized in different areas and depending on the enzymes in those tissues. So you've got the endothelial nitric oxide synthase, which was really producing nitric oxide to do many different functions such as vasodilation, antithrombotic effects, and of course, due to the vasodilation, it was regulating pressure. And also, there was also seen that it can do other things such as protecting from atherosclerotic plaques, mainly because it decreases the amount of LDL being oxidized and production of foam cells. It's also, so we talked about peroxynitrite being something that causes tissue damage. Well, the same mechanism was actually very useful and probably was taking part in the antimicrobial effect, or that's why probably in vitro we were getting the virus to be stopped from replicating and killed in certain cases because of this molecule right here. And also you've got the neuronal nitric oxide synthase. It really helps in something called neuroplasticity. So what neuroplasticity is, it's the process where the connection between two neurons becomes very strong, and in this case, when your neurons fire more often, more nitric oxide is being synthesized, which helps in the release of neurotransmitters. Also, because we talked about vasodilation right here, nitric oxide is very useful in helping getting a better oxygenation, because it allows more blood flow to reach more regions in the lung, and therefore there is better oxygenation. And this could be something why nitric oxide is helping, and also in COVID patients.